Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to a rainy Tuesday in Vancouver. Aliana's just looking around as if wondering, where the heck is everybody? Which is, I think, what we're all kind of wondering. Where is everybody? Apparently lots of people are allergic to water or will melt if they become wet, so they safely remained at home. That's true. That's true. B had to, she had a conflict with an exam or something like that, so. And there she is. Okay, so who's virtually here? Michaela's virtually here. Good morning, Michaela. Ananda's here. Good morning, Ananda. Ayushi's here. Hi, Ayushi. Ryan is here. Good evening, I guess, probably, or maybe early good morning. Rose is here. Good morning. Ashley's here. Good morning, Ashley. Kevin's here. Hello, Kevin. Adil's here. Good morning, Adil. And Hadil is here. Good morning, Hadil. And Beatrice is here. Good morning, Bea. So maybe I'll just give you a quick heads up. I think I'd like to do our third quiz on Monday. When did I have our micro paper due?
Friday.
This Friday? Okay. Yeah, do you want to do the quiz Monday then? All in favor? No, we don't have quorum here is what they call it. Do you know what quorum is? If you have a meeting of voting members, you have to have a certain percentage of those voting members there in order for the vote to count. So, for instance, if there were, 21 people in this class, 3 people is probably not enough to cast a vote that would apply to the entire class. Yeah. However, let's do it Monday, okay? So I'll post that in Microsoft Teams, and it'll be the same thing. It'll be from I guess class 21 to 30. That's kind of how we're breaking it up, I think. So 21 to 30, I'll post those in Microsoft Teams. We'll do it on Monday. Micropaper is due on Friday, so I guess I know what I'm doing this weekend, don't I? And also keep in mind that I think it's next week. Good morning, Ty. Next week, November 11th will be a holiday, so you'll have a Wednesday off. What's that? Remembrance Day, November 11th is our kind of remembering our war dead kind of day. Yeah. So any war really. I think it is. I think the November 11th date is connected to the First World War. But yeah, it's anyone who's served in the military gets remembered on that day. So yeah, you'll have a day off on November 11th, but until then, yeah. So the micropaper will be due on Friday, and we'll do a quiz on Monday from classes 21 to 30. And again, I'll post that in Microsoft Teams so that everyone has it. Okay. Moving on, oh yes, we started talking about Russia and the Soviet Union yesterday, right? The other kind of big story, the big epic story of the 20th century, right? And so we said yesterday that at the end of World War I, there were kind of some new political and economic systems appearing on the horizon, ones that had never appeared before, and democracy, of course, had existed for some time, obviously, but communism and fascism are kind of new for the period, right? And so fascism we talked about at length, and so I think we can leave that. But communism is, of course, applicable to Russia and the Soviet Union, right? And I said that it was kind of created by the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And I said that Karl Marx here, maybe I should let my beard grow a little longer. No, definitely not. Definitely not. We said that Karl Marx here was around in an age of industrial capitalism, right? And he watched what was going on and felt that industrial capitalism was exploitive, right? And so keep in mind there are no kind of protections for workers here. There's no labor laws really. people are working very, very hard in factories for the absolute minimum that factory owners can manage to pay them. And so Marx and Engels saw this and said, hey, this is exploiting the workers, right? Because the workers are doing all the work, and the profit from their labor is going to the factory owner, the bourgeoisie, right? And Karl Marx says that's not fair. That's unfair. And I think Aliana pointed out yesterday, that's capitalism. Did you point that out? Yeah, that's capitalism. And it's like, yeah, that is true, right? So in a capitalist mindset, that's entirely fair, right? That's the way it works. But to Marx, looking at this through his eyes, he said that's not fair. The workers should share equally in the profits of their own labors. That's what's fair. And so he imagined that eventually the proletariat, the people who are working in the factories, would realize this. They would come to kind of a class consciousness, is what he called it. They would realize this, and they would overthrow the bourgeoisie. They would overthrow the factory owner, take control of the means of production, which is the factory in this case, and then share the profits amongst all of the workers. And it would be fair and equal and a communist utopia, right? We said that in practice, it's kind of interesting because Karl Marx envisioned this sort of socialist economic system with a communist party running the whole thing. And eventually he said what would happen is once the state got organized in a communist or in a more socialist way, and once people kind of figured out how to do communism, really you wouldn't need a government at all, because everyone would be working as hard as they could for the state. The state would already be organized into this system, and really the state would kind of wither away, right? And so government would disappear, and you would just have this communist utopia of equals working really hard for the state, and everybody sharing kind of equally in the profits of the state. Nice dream, right? But of course, we see as the 20th century progresses, it doesn't really work out that way, right? Communism doesn't really unfold the way that Marx maybe imagined. And we'll talk about maybe some of the reasons why that's the case. But often what you find in a communist system is, in theory, the state is supposed to be subservient to individuals, okay? So the good of each individual is looked after by the state. And so, but often what you find is that the way that communist systems are run, the state comes before the individual, right? And so it's the good of the state that is important. And so it kind of depends if you're thinking about communism in sort of the pure Marxist form, or if you're thinking about the way it happens in real life, because those tend to be slightly, well, maybe more than slightly different things. The power of the state is held by the Communist Party, right? And so all communist systems, well, not all communist systems, but most are a one-party state in which the Communist Party holds all the power, makes the decisions, organizes the economy, and so on, right? And again, ideally, everything is fair and equal, right? So people give as much as they can, and they receive that which they need from the state. Again, in theory. We said that this whole story gets kicked off in Tsarist Russia, okay? And so Russia has had czars for hundreds of years prior to this, and a czar is kind of the Russian version of a king, if you will. And so the king has a royal family. He has a group of kind of noble people below him who have sort of historically prestigious names, and they have lots of titles and wealth and things like that. But that's just a very small minority of the people who live in Russia. Everyone else is kind of a dirt poor farmer, a serf who's attached to the land, has nothing, works very hard, gives most of their harvest to the nobles, and suffers through, a number of food shortages and a czar who doesn't seem to really care too much about the condition of their lives, right? And so, again, Russia is, when we come into the 1900s, Russia is ripe for a revolution. There's a massive inequality in terms of wealth and power in the country. Things are not going very well. There's lots of food shortages and supply shortages, and people are upset, right? And they're upset at, not this guy, they're upset at this guy here, Tsar Nicholas. And so Tsar Nicholas is of course, will be the last Tsar of Russia, and not a fantastic Tsar as they come, kind of not too interested in the plight of the people, pretty entitled, thinks he's, the people should be bowing down and worshiping him, but they're kind of past that at this point. And again, like I said, he's kind of more concerned with his kind of royal life and his riches and his looking after his family, and his young son, who I mentioned is ill. Nick the Bloody?
The day of his coronation,
Mm.
he did something for the people which apparently was really nice, and was like, I don't know, free what it was. So everyone, like a huge mass of people started moving toward there, and a lot of people got stepped on to death.
Mm.
Then what happened was that the Tsar in his palace thought, okay, so maybe I should say something about that, right? We should address the people if they're lost. But instead he went and partied with the French. There you go.
Yeah, so if you didn't hear that, we were just hearing a story of the coronation of Tsar Nicholas, in which a bunch of people were trampled by the crowd, and Tsar Nicholas, instead of kind of making a statement as in, oh, these poor people, he kind of went off and got drunk instead. So questionable leadership decisions from the outset, right? Yeah, and so here we have some unhappy peasants. Yesterday I asked you to read a few pages and answer a few questions. Can I give you just 3 minutes to look over that, and then do you need a little more than 3, a little less than 3? Where were we? Maud, help me out here. 7 minutes? That's enough to read the whole thing. I'll give 5 minutes. Okay.
Enough to read the whole thing?
7 minutes is enough to read the whole thing.
5 pages?
Okay. I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to review what you read yesterday here on pages 70 to 75, and then we'll talk about these questions 1 to 5 and 8. Yeah, I gave you 6 questions. No, that's okay. 6 minutes. 6 minutes, and then we'll talk. Okay, can we talk about this? All right. So, what is question number 1 here anyway? Yes, the Russo-Japanese War. It seems like we were just talking about that, but from the Japanese side, right? So now we're talking about the same conflict, but from the Russian side. And so, what was the cause of this little conflict between Mother Russia and Father Japan? I don't know. No, just Japan. What's the cause of this conflict? Anybody? Anybody?
Well, I'm not really sure if it's said here or not, but one of the causes was that the Tsar has just come to power and yeah, he just messed up with the whole make the blood thing. He had to make a name for himself. The country was falling apart, no one liked him, so war. That'll bring the people all together. And yeah, they looked down and there was a puny little island down there called Japan. Thought they can push it around. They went and they got kicked. So yeah.
Okay.
Basically, what I'm saying is that they went to wars so they could get that nationalist spirit up and hold the country together.
Okay, so a little bit of prestige and a little bit of kind of national solidarity, if you will, right? So wars are always good. Well, not always good, but sometimes they're good for kind of pulling the country together and rallying people's spirits. And so perhaps Tsar Nicholas thought it would be a good idea to start and win a war, thereby gaining some personal prestige for that, and maybe kind of uniting the country and distracting the people from their horrible plight and misery. Yeah. What else? Why else did they start this war? Say that one more time. Right. So there's this sort of Korea and Manchuria area, right, of Eastern Asia, and it's very rich, right, in terms of raw materials and minerals and things like that. And of course, we know that Japan already wants that area for itself, right, because Japan is attempting to industrialize and they're going to need raw materials, right? And so those raw materials are going to be equally attractive to Russia, whether they're industrializing or whether they can just take them and sell them, right? And so this area is rich with resources and is useful to both places. What else does Russia kind of want out of that?
They want control over the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the Trans-Siberian Railways there, so
Mm-hmm.
exclusive, but they mainly wanted it, control it, and Japan was playing around, so it wasn't good.
Yeah, it's true. So the Russians had just completed a Trans-Siberian Railway, so you could now take a train all the way from Moscow or St. Petersburg all the way to, I think Vladivostok must have been the end point for it, but I'm not entirely sure. I rode a short section of the Trans-Siberian, which was kind of cool. But yeah, they want access to the Pacific as well, right? If they have a port, they can trade with other nations. They can sail around and take what they want if they're strong enough. And so they want access to the Pacific, and they want access to those resources in Manchuria, just like Japan does, right? So there's a little conflict between them. They have a little war. And how does that turn out for the Russians? Nicely. In that they lose.
They mess it up.
Mm-hmm. So the Russians lose this war, right? And again, it's embarrassing because Japan is a small nation. They're not very industrialized at this point. They're not very powerful. The Russians have the numbers. They have the wealth. They're a European country, which are kind of perceived to be more stronger or more competent in battle. But either way, the Russians lose, right? And so it's a huge ego boost for the Japanese, who feel great about this. But of course, the opposite effect for the Russians, right? The fact that they have been defeated now by this tiny little the underdog, right? The tiny little nation of Japan who never should have been able to defeat Russia has, right? And disaster. So what's the effect of this in terms of Russia? What's the effect of losing this war?
Well, they were humiliated. They had to go around with all the costs that come from losing a war.
Right, so they had incurred a lot of cost in that war and had not really gained anything from it. They're humiliated. What else happens?
Does the Tsar cause any famine this time? Because Russian rulers have the tendency of causing famine.
Does he cause any? I'm not entirely sure if he causes famine in this regard. Famines are kind of, I wouldn't say common, but they sort of happen periodically throughout this period. So I'm not sure if it causes one or not. There may be one that happens in conjunction. I'm not sure about that. That what couldn't be ignored? Oh, right. So the I guess the cry for political change grows even louder, right? And so again, Russians are humiliated by this loss, but it's a loss in terms of prestige for the Tsar too, right? Now the Tsar looks like a fool, leading the country, proud Russia into battle, and then losing to Japan, right? So he doesn't look very good, and so all of those people who are upset with the Tsar and upset with the situation in Russia, they're advocating more strongly now. They're like, hey, we want something to change, right? We want something to happen here. And so as part of this, we have an event that happens on this Bloody Sunday. So what happens on Bloody Sunday?
Priest guy, I don't remember his name.
Father Gapon?
Yes. Marches down towards the palace with a bunch of people, very calm, very peacefully, just to deliver a piece of paper with some demands on it to the Tsar and his officers.
Mm-hmm.
The military officer sees them coming, he panics, he gives the order, they take the shots.
Yes. So, yeah, this group of people are kind of going to the Winter Palace where the Tsar rules from in St. Petersburg. They have a list of grievances that they would like the Tsar to receive, right? A list of things that they are unsatisfied with. They head up to the Winter Palace. The guards get spooked, or there's a miscommunication. Either way, a number of these innocent people are shot, right, on the steps of the Winter Palace. That doesn't look good either, right? So the people are even more upset, right? More demonstrations, more frustration, more anger. Number 4, what does Russia's domestic economy kind of look like at this period? What's it look like? It's busted or they're busted?
Both?
Both, yeah. Okay, that's fair, both. So what do you mean by it's busted?
It's in ruin. It's not looking good. It's really bad.
So they're a country with a pretty rapidly growing population, right? They mentioned that I think in the space of 30 years or so, the population grows by 61 million people. Is that what the stat was? Was it from 1890 to 1914? Somebody double check that for me.
Well, there is from 1914
There.
61 million, but I don't see the beginning of it.
Oh, maybe not. Yep, between 1890 and 1914, the population increased by 61 million people. It's a lot more mouths to feed, right? And again, when we hear about Russian agriculture, it's brutal, right? There's no fertilizer, there's no proper farm implements. Everybody is just kind of farming in the sort of least efficient, least technologically adapted way possible, right? So food outputs are low, right? Famines are common. And what? Yeah, not many people are employed, right? There's not much in the way of industrialization in Russia at the time. There's a little bit, but not very much. So it's a very kind of, for the period, it's a very underdeveloped economy. There's no industrialization happening. Agriculture is, no investment has been made in it in terms of technology or kind of agricultural practices. And so Russia is basically starving itself, right? It doesn't produce enough food for its people to eat. And spoiler alert, that situation is going to continue for a long time, but right now it's not happening. What do they say about their natural resources? Something about some of Russia's natural resources, like their mining, mineral deposits and things like that.
They were held by outside foreigners. They were mostly held by foreigners and enjoyed them. So yeah, the Russians have done.
Yeah, the Russians sold off the rights to a lot of their natural resources, right? And so that gives you some cash in hand right away, but who's really making the money off those resources?
They did that, really?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idiots took a lot of stuff from my country. That's what I remember from our history, and then they sold their own.
The problem is that often if you have natural resources, say you have iron ore or something, your country might have a lot of it, but in order to actually profit from it, you need to start with a lot of money, right? So you need the technology to sort of dig a mine, to get the iron out of the ground, to maybe just smelt it down into a rough form so you can weigh it and sell it. And then you need roads, you need railways, you need a port to get the iron out of your country. You need a lot of infrastructure in place in order to sell your iron. And for a lot of colonized countries, but also for Russia in this period, either they don't have that money, or in the case of Russia, they probably don't want to invest it either. And so the easiest thing to do is to say, okay, Britain or France, we'll sell you the rights to this mine for this much. And so they get their money, and then Britain does all the work, right? Britain invests in sort of the infrastructure to get those minerals out of Russia, to process them, and then to sell them. They wind up making the cash, right? They wind up making the profit, but Russia didn't have the money for the infrastructure to actually do that in the first place. And often you'll find that with lots of colonized countries in Africa, they'll sell off the rights to their resources because either they don't have a choice or because they just don't have the money to build the infrastructure to sell it themselves, unfortunately.
Making the Russian case, they just didn't want to do that.
It's very possible. And that I don't know, whether it was impossible for them to do or whether it was just too much trouble. Because again, you have to put out a significant investment first in order to get your money back later. And it's possible that these kind of rich, entitled czars felt like, ugh, I don't want to spend my money on railways when I could be spending it on Fabergé eggs or whatever. I don't know. I'm making this up. But either way, it doesn't happen, right? And so the easiest thing to do is just sell the rights to your natural resources if you have them, but it's not really the way to make money if you can avoid it. But for a lot of countries around the world, they haven't been able to avoid it. And in the case of Russia, I'm not sure if they choose to or if they're just stuck. But either way, that's what they do. And again, it's not the way to make money. And they're in debt, right? And they're in debt. They borrowed a lot of money from foreign banks as well. So the balance sheet does not look good for Russia, right? There's been some mismanagement. There's been some mismanagement here. Let's see. 4 major reasons for the Russian Revolution. What did they say for this? You were so quiet. What?
The safety standards in the industries are how you
Okay, so Aliana mentions that there are the safety standards and working conditions are very poor for many people. That's true. What else? I'm actually just going to look at my slides and see what I have.
Because around 1914, the Germans coming in.
Right. So Russia gets, well, I don't know if they get pulled into a war. They declare war, right, in 1914 after, you remember that whole thing with Franz Ferdinand and Austria-Hungary and Serbia, and the Russians backed up Serbia, and they were into a war, right? And again, nobody in Russia cared much about Franz Ferdinand, but there they were, right, fighting a war that they really weren't equipped to fight, right, in terms of industrial capability, in terms of money, in terms of equipment, in terms of food. The Russians don't have any of those things, right? And yet suddenly, like they're already struggling, and now they're at war. They're sending millions of their young men off to the front, underprepared, undersupplied, and again, it doesn't really go very well for them. The only thing that goes well for the Russians in World War I is that they have a lot of people, and so they can continue to send wave after wave of their people to fight in the war, but they're not really succeeding. They're not really succeeding because of their strategy or tactics or equipment. They're just succeeding because there's a lot of them, right? Which is
The German
brutal.
president guy,
Von Hindenburg.
he kicks the butt of two Russian armies, each of them twice the size of his own army,
Mm-hmm.
like at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So again, the war doesn't go very well, and Russia isn't in a position to fight it anyway, but yet they are. What else? Yeah, so agricultural production is low, right? And so people can be, you can get away with a lot if your people are actually fed, right? But when your people are going hungry, nobody has any patience for that, right? So, say what you will about what's going on in the United States today, because there's an election, but for the most part, people are fed, right? For the most part, everyone has a meal on their table. But I guarantee you, if huge sections of the U.S. population were starving or experiencing famine, you would see things would get a lot worse, right? And so here we have people who are, can't even get food on the table, never mind anything else. So that doesn't make people happy. What else is going on here? What else can we point a finger at as a cause?
There were a lot of strikes going on.
Yeah. So continued public pressure and strikes. Yep.
And a lot of the people were being shot at.
Yeah. As protests get more and more heated, violence is more and more common and likely to occur. What else?
At some point, they will take turns on the government.
Yes, and that's going to happen a little bit later. But yes, at one point the military, the Red Guard, actually sides with the people, right? You did read about that, right, in that section? No?
No, I didn't read it.
Is it not in that section? Okay. There is a point where the people are sort of demonstrating outside of, I'm not sure if it's the Winter Palace but they're chanting that, there's not enough agriculture, there's not enough food, and they're lined up outside the food storage facility. And eventually the guards feel so bad, they just decide, okay, we're going to open the gates and give the food to the people. So the army actually goes over to the side of the people, which is not good for the czars. What did the czars what do they not do in the context of all of this? What do they not? They don't do everything? They don't do anything, yeah. So there's a lot of opportunity here for the czar to make changes, right? It's pretty clear that the people are suffering. It's very clear that the people are unhappy. If he talks to his treasurer, he should probably find out that Russia has no money. So the evidence is kind of staring him in the face, right? And yet he seems not to pay attention. He seems not to do anything about it, right? So there's opportunities for the czar to do something, right? He's the Tsar. He has ultimate power, and yet he does nothing to kind of alleviate the condition of the people. And in fact, he continues to make it worse by engaging in this war that is ultimately pointless for Russia, but is costing them huge numbers of their young men and a huge amount of money that they don't have.
So the royal family loses its prestige after our friend Rasputin shows up.
Right.
This is mentioned here.
Yeah, we have a story of the Tsarina. Is it Alexandra?
The Tsar's wife?
Yeah. No, it's like
really, really funny. The Tsar leaves to fight the Germans, and he leaves his German wife to rule.
yeah, but her name's Ekaterina, isn't it? Shoot, what is her name? Anyway, huh? Alexandra. So he leaves his wife Alexandra to kind of rule while he is off fighting, and Alexandra comes under the influence of a faith healer, a mystic, a charlatan. Yes, a so-called magician or whatever, Rasputin, right? And so he kind of controls her, he kind of manipulates her and winds up kind of in charge of Russia for a while through her because he's gaslighting her, right? He's of what? Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on, right? Anything else that we missed? So the czars are kind of doing a bad job running the country. We've got agricultural production that cannot keep up with their population growth. We've got lots of people demonstrating in the streets and saying, "We want change, we want change." And the Tsar seems to have his like AirPods in or something and doesn't hear what's going on, right? And we have Russia involved in a war in which huge numbers of their people are dying. They're not really winning. It's costing them money that they don't have, and people are probably saying, "Why are we in this war anyway?" Right? Because who the heck is Franz Ferdinand, right? And remember when Japan beat us like 10 years ago, and now we're going to take on Germany? That's not going to turn out well, right? So people are probably lost confidence in the Tsar, in Russia, and everything looks bad. Everything looks as bad as it could possibly look, right?
And then Nicholas should have not left his wife alone.
What's that?
He should have not left his wife.
Well, maybe not. I would argue that even if he didn't leave his wife alone to rule, he probably would have done an equally poor job of administering the country because he had been.
He went off to take command of the army.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he had no training. And there was a really qualified people there to lead the army.
That's the great thing about monarchies and dynasties is it doesn't matter how competent you are, it matters if you're in line for the throne, right? So that's the problem with hereditary monarchies, right? You might get someone who's competent, or you might get someone who has no idea what they're doing. Either way, they're the boss, right? So what happens here? There's a revolution in 1905, I believe, right? And what happens during that?
So I remember saying hearing that one revolution happens, the country's almost on the brink of collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens is that the Tsar does some stuff.
Yep.
He gives the people some things. He gives the Republicans or socialists or whatever their own provisional government.
Yes.
All works out. Then he shuts down the provisional government. And they will be like, the people won't stand for it, but the people are mostly dead. So let them not stand for it.
Right. So let's take a step back there. So at one point, the things get so bad that a provisional government is established, right? And so here we have kind of a mini parliament or kind of a mini legislature. They call it the Duma, right? And the Duma is meant to share power with the Tsar, right? And so, in theory, I guess, the Duma is supposed to represent the people, and the Tsar can continue to rule. I don't know if they mention it in the textbook or not, but who do you think the members of the Duma are? Do you think they're the poor agricultural peasants, or do you think they're the nobles?
Weren't the poor agricultural peasants? I don't think that they were all the nobles either. Some of them were just some politically active.
True, but to be politically active, you had to have a certain amount of money, right? Because most people were, just very poor and working on the farm wearing rags kind of thing, right? So if you can find your way into the provisional government, you are someone who has some means, right? So again, the most of the population of Russia isn't really represented in this Duma. It's mostly people with some money and power already, right? And so we've got this group of people and we've got the Tsar. How does that power sharing situation work out?
If you're the Tsar, then it works out pretty well for you. If you're not, then not that good.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. But it actually works in that they don't really cooperate very well, right? And so the Tsar kind of, I think, resents the fact that he has to deal with this provisional government. It's a bit of a, it's a constraint on his power, which he doesn't really appreciate. There are people that are allied with the Tsar who don't really like the provisional government either. But the provisional government itself is kind of squabbling, and it doesn't really work very well. There's lots of internal struggles. There's kind of coalitions in that a few powerful members of the Duma get together and try to, get control of the government, and it kind of collapses a few times. And so again, we have this provisional government that is meant to, I guess, help the Tsar or represent the people. I don't think it winds up doing either of those things. So it's kind of a mess, right? Nobody likes the situation. The Duma itself cannot cooperate or work together, and so that doesn't operate very well either. Let me just see. Just give me a second to see where I am here. Okay, I know where I am. All right, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, I will review some of the things that happened on the lead up to this revolution, and then we'll talk about Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, if you prefer. Okay, let's take a break. Okay. Okay, and we're back. We were just talking about the election tonight. If anyone's paying attention, of course, the U.S. is having their presidential election, which is big news here in North America and probably big news worldwide, I would say. And what we were saying is that it's kind of hard to know when we'll have an official winner. So many people have mailed in their ballots that those are going to take a lot of time to count. And again, I'm not sure, don't quote me on this, but I don't think those ballots can be opened until the polls close. So again, it might take a couple weeks to tally all of those up. And in the meantime, it's not clear if it will look like Trump has won, or if it will look like Biden has won, or if anyone will be convinced by anything they see, or what Trump will do if he doesn't like the result, or what he'll do if he does like the result. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. So keep your eyes on the news tonight and tomorrow, because it might be an interesting ride. And hopefully it will not be the end of democracy as we know it. What?
Like you say, hopefully it won't be the end of.
Hopefully not. But yeah, it's a weird situation. It's kind of never really happened before in this way, so we'll see. See how it turns out, I suppose. Eek. Okay. So before we had a break, we talked about this, right? We said that there was a conflict over Manchuria. There was a couple other reasons probably implicated in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 as well. But both the Russians and the Japanese are looking for access to Manchuria for natural resources. Both of them would like to have a port there so that they can trade and sort of patrol the area. They start warring with each other, and the Japanese come out as the winners, right? An unexpected winner. The Japanese are elated and get a huge boost of self-esteem. The Russians, humiliation, right? And the Tsar has egg on his face, if you will. That's if you've ever heard that expression. But it's embarrassing for him, right? It's his personal prestige declines, right? And so again, for the Japanese, they suddenly feel that they are, invincible and they can take on anyone because they took on Russia and won, which is not entirely untrue. And of course, the Russians are humiliated and the credibility of the Tsar is undermined. And so Bloody Sunday, which Aliana asked if it actually took place on a Sunday. I don't know for sure. I assume so. Maybe Bloody Tuesday just didn't have the same kind of ring to it. Bloody Monday just sounded too dark, so I don't know. I'm not sure. I assume it happened on Sunday, where some workers led by a local priest march on the Winter Palace to make their demands known to the Tsar. Things get a little bit out of control, and some of these people get shot, right? And this makes the Russian people even more angry. We said that the Russians were, in terms of their economy, they were not in great shape, right? They were kind of living on borrowed money. They weren't producing enough food to feed their population. They had just slightly industrialized, but they were far, far behind any of the other industrial powers like Britain or France or even Germany at this point. And so they are a poor country of kind of landless peasants that owe a lot of money and don't really have a lot going for them except for a massive population. And so again, Russia's ripe for revolution here, and there's lots of reasons why people might want one. And so again, we have ineffective rule by the Romanovs, right? So the Tsar is really doing a horrible job of leading the country and has the opportunity to change, right? But is uninterested in doing so, right? He's just interested in ruling the way he always has. There's been no investment in agriculture, and so people are kind of farming in a very inefficient way that doesn't produce a lot of crops. People are demonstrating wanting labor reform and more safety standards. They're not getting that either. one thing we didn't mention here was weak infrastructure. And so, yes, they built the Trans-Siberian Railway, which goes all the way across Russia, but there's not actually a lot of other railways in place at the time. And so that's a problem for an industrial country, right? You need to be able to move goods. You need to be able to move goods throughout your country, right? And this is a period of time where trucks are not really in existence, right? There's no trucks, there's no planes, and so if you don't have rail access to a place, how can you move things from one place to another? Horse cart. Maybe you can float things down the river on a barge if you have a river handy. You can't move anything anywhere, right? So again, this is the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s is a period of rapid change industrially. People are investing in infrastructure, but here in Russia they're not doing that, and they're falling behind, and it's hurting them. And again, they're under a lot of strain from World War I. They are unprepared for the battle. They don't have the weapons. They don't have the strategy. They have the people, but the people don't have the food, and so they are horribly outmatched, right? And all they have going for them is the fact that they have lots of people to lose, which is awful, right? So we said that after the 1905 revolution, they create a provisional government, right? They create a Duma. What does provisional mean, by the way? If I asked you to define it, what's provisional? Temporary? What did you say? No? Providing, yeah. Well, it does sound like it's connected to the word provide, right? Amanda, you want to take a swing at this one? Provisional? No? I think you're probably closest there, Ahmad. I think, yeah, temporary for the time being. Until the real one gets going, kind of thing. That's what a provisional government is. And so it provides a government temporarily until a real formal government is set up. See what I did there? Yeah. So they create a provisional government, right, to help kind of run the state. But like we mentioned, it was not super successful. The Tsar didn't like it. There were elements of the nobles who were trying to sort of get in the way of what the provisional government was doing. There were power struggles within the provisional government, and so it was not quite as effective as it could have been, right?
So is this after or before the abdication?
This is before the abdication, I believe. Or is it?
They have a prime minister. I think the guy came in
Oh,
after the abdication.
right. It is no, because he abdicates in 1917, right?
Well, not completely sure about that, but I know that when he abdicates, that prime minister is there. Then Lenin comes in and blows it up with the
Yeah.
warships or whatever down the river.
Let me just see here. I think that's a good question. Where are we in history here? Let me just look. I don't think he has stepped down quite yet. I don't think, because he's still leading the war effort. I think in 19. Huh? Leading it. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of detail here in terms of names that you probably don't need to know. There's Lvov and Kerensky and who's the third guy? Kerensky, Lvov, and his name will come up in a second. These guys you probably don't need to worry too much about. Alexander Kerensky's name will come up again. He's a prominent kind of Russian at this time, but you don't really need to worry too much about the names. One thing I would like you to pay attention to is these things. It says here that the provisional government had Lvov as prime minister with the support of the Petrograd Soviet. What's a Soviet?
It was something to do with the workers.
Something to do with the workers? And anyone else want to take a swing? What's a Soviet? Soviet.
Their own little mini parliament, but it was
Ooh.
workers.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah. So these Soviets, what these Soviets are is that they are workers' councils. And so going into this period in kind of the 1910s or so, or the 1915s, Russia is not being run very well. I think we've established that, right? And so what these do is these workers' councils kind of create a little mini government to run the cities, okay? And so they're a little council, they're elected, so people can choose them. And so the Soviets kind of take over administering the cities. So they're almost like a little municipal government. There's almost like a city council and a mayor. But because nobody seems to have any control over what's going on and things are so bad, these councils kind of just elect themselves into existence and start operating as if they're the government. And they're kind of allowed to because nobody has any real control over the situation. And so they actually gain power this way because even though they're not entirely legitimate or kind of endorsed by the government, the people like them because they start actually establishing some sort of order in the cities, right? So somebody is actually in control, making decisions, making sure things happen. And so some of these Soviets become quite powerful, right? And so if you want the people of Petrograd or St. Petersburg, if you want the people of St. Petersburg to go along with what you say, then it'll help if you can get the Petrograd Soviet to agree with you, right? And so they kind of put themselves in place as a representative of these cities, and the cities support them because these people are actually doing something. they're actually, administering the city and making sure things are happening, right? And so these Soviets kind of become more and more powerful through this period as they begin to run the cities and people increasingly support them as legitimate representatives and as people who can administer the city in a proper way, okay? So again, we've got a few coalitions that happen here, a few different governments with one with this guy Lvov here as prime minister, but that doesn't happen, and so it collapses. There's another coalition with Lvov as prime minister again, with Alexander Kerensky as minister of war. That one doesn't really pan out either, and so there's Kornilov, right? And then there's a Kornilov guy in there as well. And so there's a lot of detail here, but basically what's happening is that there's power struggles within the provisional government, right? So we've got the Tsar on one hand, who is a authority, but he's kind of losing his power as time goes on. We've got a provisional government who's fighting amongst themselves, trying to create some kind of government that they can agree to and work with. And then there's these little Soviets popping up all over the place that are running the cities and increasingly getting the support of the regular people. So there's a lot of different things happening in Russia as it kind of, I guess its governmental system is kind of evolving on its own, right? And it's very fluid and it's very loose and nobody knows what's going to happen. In the midst of this, the Tsar does step down. And so finally, the Tsar is convinced to step down, and the provisional government is tasked with designing a new constitution, right? And so the idea here is that, okay, we're not going to have the Tsar as the kind of head of state anymore, or at least the decision maker. All of the decisions will be made by the Duma. And so what is the Duma? How does it work? What are its powers? How do you become a member of the Duma? All of those things have to be decided, and that's what the government is working on when this guy shows up on the scene. This guy. So here he is, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin as history knows him, reading a copy of Pravda, which is the popular Russian paper of the time. Do you know what Pravda means? Pravda means truth in Russian. As time goes on, we'll see that Pravda is anything but truth. It will eventually become an instrument of government propaganda, but it's still called the truth. So Lenin is the head of a political party called the Bolsheviks, right? And as Ahmad and I were talking about before, Bolshe is the Russian word for more, right? So the Bolsheviks are the more party, or maybe they're trying to convince people that they're the majority. They're not, but maybe a name is, the name is helpful, right?
There was an election at some point where the Bolsheviks were pretty much sure that they're going to win, but they didn't.
Right, and I'm going to skip over that just to make this story a little more simple. So Russia it looks like it's moving towards some kind of democracy or some kind of republic situation, but Lenin in some ways isn't really having any of that, because Lenin's not really interested in democracy, and he's not interested in capitalism either, right? Because he's been heavily influenced by Karl Marx, and he and his party are dedicated to a revolution, right? A revolution in which the means of production are turned over to the people and a communist utopia is created, right? Just like Karl Marx, just like Uncle Karl always promised, right? And so Lenin here gains support with a very simple slogan: peace, land, bread, right? And so it doesn't come any simpler than that, but this is really what the Russian people are hungering for at the moment, right? They are stuck in a war that is bleeding them dry, literally and figuratively, right? They want peace. They want land. So the peasants, none of these peasants own their land, and they want to, right? They want to be able to own their own land and sort of harvest their crops and sell them for profit, right? They want to be able to do that. Right now, all of their excess goes to the nobles. And finally, bread, right? People are constantly going hungry because there's famines and agricultural production problems. People want to eat, right? So it's a pretty simple formula here, right? A pretty simple promise that Lenin is making to the people: peace, land, bread, right? And so this is kind of, more specifically, this is what he's promising. He's promising that he will remove Russia from World War I. He's promising that land will be redistributed to the peasants. Sort of true, but we'll get there. And finally, he wants to transfer industry power and governmental power to the Soviets, right? And so he manages to get the backing of some of these Soviet groups behind him because he's promising to sort of make them legitimate, right? He's saying, yes, you guys just appeared out of nowhere. You're running the cities. The people are supporting you, but I'll officially give you that power, right? Even though you're kind of working in an unofficial way right now, I'll officially give you that power. So he's speaking to the people, he's speaking to the peasants, and he's speaking to the Soviets, right? Right. So this is the creation of the Duma here. We've talked about this already. We've talked about World War I, and here we go. Now, this is where things kind of boil over, if you will. So in February of 1917, protests are getting increasingly worse, right? There's a shortage of bread. There's a shortage of coal. What are they using coal for in this period, probably? What? Yeah, to heat your house, right? You need coal for your stove to heat your house. Do you think you want a shortage of coal in Russia in February? No, you don't, right? Russian winters are serious things. You do not want a shortage of coal or bread. So people are cold, they're hungry, and they are angry, right? And so this is where what we talked about a little bit earlier, where people are demonstrating and striking outside of a government storage facility, and the Tsarist troops, the Red Guard, no, they're not the Red Guard, the Tsarist troops actually open the gates and say, you know what, forget it. We're going to give these people their food, they're hungry, they're cold, take what you need, right? So the government troops are actually going over to the side of the people, right? So all of these protests force Tsar Nicholas to abdicate. Okay, so he's convinced that the best thing for him to do is step down as Tsar, which he does.
Then he was supposed like his son wasn't exactly good to rule, and because all you have to do is just a little cannon pushing in his arm and that's what he's dead. His brother wasn't eager to rule either.
No, and I think, you know, basically the point is, well, not the point, but I think where Russia was at is that nobody wanted a Tsar anymore, and so it was over, right? The period of Tsars has passed, and I think Nicholas is finally forced to admit that. I think. So again, so the Tsar steps down, and the provisional government is tasked with trying to run the country, create a new constitution, figure out what to do with the war, and deal with all of these Soviets, right? These workers' councils that have popped up and have this illegitimate power, but they have power nonetheless. Right, so we've got a few coalitions here that kind of appear and fall. And then when does this happen? I should have some dates in this. I was trying to simplify the story, but I think not having the dates there has...
So which one is
This is where, I think this is the fall of the first coalition. And this is where Lenin is kind of in Russia, but is forced to flee because the provisional government has labeled him as a German spy, which I'm not sure that he is. I think he's just he's trouble for the provisional government is what he is. And so Lvov is trying to get rid of him, and so they call him a German spy, and he has to flee to Finland in order to not be imprisoned, right?
And then that guy, little man
Chudovsky?
Trudowski.
Trudowski?
Yeah.
Maybe he's related to Trudeau.
Well, the guy who.
Maybe his ancestors just came to Canada and got rid of the ski and no.
The guy who, that dude, the mustache guy.
Or maybe Trudeau is new.
The mustache?
Yes, Stalin.
Stalin.
Okay, straight up. Trudowski.
Oh, Trotsky. Leon Trotsky.
Right.
Yeah, he's a Bolshevik. He's around here too. Right. So these kind of government coalitions are rising and falling. They're not really working out. And when the second coalition collapses, this is Lenin's moment, right? And so, like we said, the Germans kind of conspire to sneak him back into Russia to destabilize Russia, or to get it out of the war, actually, which works. And again, Lenin appears, and they have their revolution in October. And so this is the sort of famous October Revolution. In Russia, there are still streets called 28th of October Street, because I used to work in a university building in Russia that was on 28th of October Street, or no, 25th of October Street, and it memorializes this revolution, right? So here you can see that the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and led by Trotsky, with the backing of both the Moscow and the St. Petersburg Soviets, they storm the Winter Palace, right?
There they find the death squad.
The death what?
Death squad. There were some guards in the Winter Palace called the Death Squadron. They surrendered right away.
Exactly. And we can talk about that. There's a little more detail in the article I'm going to have you read tomorrow, probably. But yeah, so the Bolsheviks storm the Winter Palace, manage to take it over. They throw the members of the provisional government in jail, and that's it, right? And so Lenin is the leader of the Bolsheviks and now has installed himself as the leader of Russia, right? And so the Duma is gone, right? It's all their members are in jail, and that's kind of it. And now Russia has a communist government, right? And so, again, there's lots of, it's kind of this period of kind of destabilization. The Tsar is kind of losing power. The Duma is kind of gaining power but can't seem to organize itself or agree on what it wants to do. There are these Soviet sort of workers' councils appearing that have a lot of power. It's a bit of a chaotic situation. And then, out of nowhere, Lenin appears with his Bolsheviks. They storm the Winter Palace. They take over. They throw the members of the provisional government in jail. And that's it, right? Lenin is now the leader of Russia, right? And so, you know, it's a long struggle, right? There's a 17-year period of sort of famine and misery and cold and demonstrating, and finally this happens reasonably quickly, and suddenly, yeah, the Bolsheviks are in power.
Yeah, the struggle and the misery goes on for everyone.
Yes, it does. The struggle and the misery is not over. Don't worry. There'll be far more of that to go around, unfortunately, for the Russians. But this is the event, right? That will change the rest of the 20th century. And it's interesting. It's interesting to think about what would have happened had this revolution not occurred, because again, it's been such an influential. The ripple effect of that is massive, right? Okay, let me see where I am here. Oh yeah, the last thing I want to point out to you. Now, the October Revolution is portrayed later in Soviet history as the communist revolution, right? Because the communists gained power of Russia. But is this actually a communist revolution? Because remember what I told you a little bit earlier, Karl Marx had written in his books that how this would happen is that the factory workers would suddenly realize that, hey guys, we're being exploited, right? We're being exploited by the bourgeoisie. We should overthrow them, take control of the means of production for ourselves, and then we'll share equally in the profits, right? That's a communist revolution as per Karl Marx. But is that what happened here? No, what did happen here? Chaos. What is this, Amanda? Is this a communist revolution? Huh? You have no idea? Did the factory workers rise up and overthrow, or the factory workers overthrow the owners? The Tsar already stepped down.
Yeah, well, the point is that he wasn't there anymore.
He was not there anymore.
And then later on, they did get rid of the owners. Kind of.
Right, kind of. But I don't know.
But they only called the government.
I kind of feel like this is more, I kind of feel like this is a coup d'etat. This is an overthrow of the state, right? You had a provisional government working on some sort of republic constitution for Russia, and then that guy, I didn't do it, Lenin shows up with his Bolsheviks with guns, storms the government buildings, and throws the government in jail, right? So I would suggest that this is actually not a communist revolution. This is a coup d'etat. This is an overthrow of the state by communists. This is not Karl Marx's communist revolution. This is Lenin's revolution. This is an overthrow of the state by a political party who likes communism, right? So it will, and you'll read about this a little bit in the article, but it will be portrayed later as a victory of the people, right? Like the people rose up and overthrew the government, and Lenin was just kind of right at the head of this. And That's really not what was going on at all, right? This was Lenin's small group seizing power for themselves. This is not the people's revolution. This is the Bolshevik revolution, right? And they gain power, and then, as we'll see, communism will come from the top down. Marx says it's supposed to come from the bottom up, right? The people are supposed to realize they're being exploited, overthrow the people on top of them, and then everybody is equal. But again, we'll see that that's not quite what's happening here, right? Instead, a communist party takes control of the government, and then they're going to enforce communism from the top down, which is not what Marx was suggesting. Aliana, what were you going to say? No? You were going to say no? That makes no sense. You don't think you should? Why?
I don't think it's right.
Okay. Do you want to try?
I was gonna say maybe it could be revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because like communists, the whole group was a communist.
Definitely. So I think this may not sound like much of a distinction to you, but I think it's not a communist revolution. It's a state overthrow by communists, right? So the Bolsheviks were communists, and they overthrew the state. But again, that comes from kind of the top down, not from the bottom up.
Okay.
And
But who said that it's a communist revolution?
who says it is? The Bolsheviks are going to say.
And like in the same opposite time?
Yeah. So later on, they're going to portray this event as, oh, this is the people's revolution. The people rose up, and it was quite heroic, just like Marx always said. But it actually wasn't quite that way. It was different, right? But Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Communist Party are going to sort of retell history in a way that kind of suits their narrative, right? So yeah, it didn't really go the way Marx said that it should. It was an overthrow of the state by people who just liked communism, not a real communist revolution where, the people suddenly realize there's a better way and they overthrow the people on top of them, almost spontaneously. The people were unhappy.
Karl Marx's view was a little too
It was a little too what?
Like the people started to realize, oh my God, we're being exploited. Let's get rid of them. Yeah, that doesn't happen. You always need a leader.
Well, it's true, and certainly this is the first time. This is the first time that communism has been, real world tested, right? So, again, and as we'll read in the article tomorrow, Lenin believed in this sort of traditional Marxist uprising, but he didn't think it was going to happen. He thought it wasn't going to happen in his lifetime. And so there's actually diary writings of him talking to his wife and saying, yeah, this is never going to happen, because Marx says that, the people are working in factories and they have this sudden epiphany or they come to realize something, but Russia isn't even industrialized yet. And so, Lenin was looking forward to a communist revolution, but he looked at Russia and said, it's never going to happen here, or at least it's not going to happen for decades, right? And so I don't know if he changes his mind and decides to just make it happen anyway, or I'm not sure what his thought process was, but even he knew what sort of a traditional Marxist revolution would look like, and he realized that it's not going to happen here the way that Marx says that it should. And so I'm not sure if he was just impatient and unwilling to wait, or if he felt it would never happen and he had to make it happen. Hard to know. But he does it either way. And Russia wakes up, in November of 1917 with communists in charge. Okay, that's enough for today, I think. So tomorrow, when we start tomorrow, I have a little article for you to read on kind of historical significance and talking about what if this thing had never happened, but also talks a little bit more of the detail about how it did happen. So we'll do that tomorrow, and then we'll continue on. Okay. So thanks everybody. I will bid you adieu, and I'll see you tomorrow. Okay. So.